Sign the papers, Imani. Your purpose here was to provide an heir, and you are barren. You are no longer of any use to us. Leave this house immediately." Eleanor Dayton's voice was as cold as the marble floors of the grand mansion. Imani froze, her world shattering as Julian, her husband, stood silently by his mother's side, his silence a final deafening betrayal. They cast her out with nothing but a devastating lie, convinced she was a beautiful but worthless footnote in their family's history. If you're already feeling that fire of injustice, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is, so drop it in the comments below. They thought they had secured their legacy. They never imagined that the woman they threw away carried the only thing that truly mattered. Stick around, because her quiet disappearance was not an end, but a beginning, and the woman they labeled Barren is about to return with the secret that will make her the inheritor of it all. The Dayton mansion loomed like a monument to old money, its white columns gleaming under the late afternoon sun, a testament to a legacy that stretched back generations. Inside, Imani Washington moved through its halls with the grace of a woman who had learned to navigate a world that never quite welcomed her. At 28, she was a vision, her deep brown skin glowing against the tailored cream dress she wore, her eyes sharp with intelligence, her smile warm enough to melt even the iciest of hearts. But in this house, warmth was a currency rarely spent. Imani had once been a rising star, a financial analyst with a corner office, and a future that sparkled with promise. She'd traded it all for love, or so she thought, when she married Julian Dayton, the sole heir to the Dayton real estate empire. Julian, with his easy charm and boyish grin, had swept her off her feet in a whirlwind romance that felt like a fairy tale. But fairy tales, Imani was learning, often hid thorns beneath their roses. The mansion was a gilded cage, its opulence suffocating. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across mahogany paneling, and every room echoed with the weight of expectation. Imani's days were spent playing the part of the perfect wife, hosting charity galas, smiling through tedious dinners with Julian's associates, and enduring the sharp, veiled barbs of her mother-in-law, Eleanor Dayton. Eleanor was the iron fist in a velvet glove, a woman whose beauty had hardened into something cold and unyielding. Her pale blue eyes seemed to dissect Imani with every glance, as if searching for flaws to justify her disdain. "Such vibrant energy you have, Imani," Eleanor would say, her voice dripping with condescension as she sipped her martini. "Tell me, did they teach you about Renaissance art in that neighborhood of yours?" The words were a blade, slicing at Imani's roots, her childhood in a lively, close-knit black community, her scholarship to an Ivy League school, her hard-won place in a world that often tried to shut her out. Imani would smile, deflect with a witty remark, and swallow the sting. She did it for Julian, for the love she believed they shared. But Julian was not the man she'd married. The man who had once whispered promises of forever had grown distant, his spine softened under his mother's influence. He was a prince in public, attentive and adoring, but in private he deferred to Eleanor's every whim. When Imani suggested returning to work, craving the intellectual spark of her old life, Julian's face would cloud. "Mother thinks it's best if you focus on the family," he'd say, avoiding her eyes. And so Imani stayed, her dreams tucked away like a dress she'd outgrown. The true weight of her imprisonment came 2 years into their marriage. The whispers had started months ago. Eleanor's pointed questions about grandchildren, her sighs at Imani's failure to conceive. "The Dayton line must continue," she'd say, her gaze boring into Imani as if she were a defective machine. The pressure mounted, a slow poison seeping into every corner of Imani's life. Julian began to echo his mother's words, his once gentle touch now hesitant, his eyes clouded with disappointment. Then came the appointment. Eleanor had arranged it, of course, with a family doctor whose credentials were as impeccable as his loyalty to the Daytons. Dr. Hargrove's office was sterile, all white walls and gleaming instruments, a fitting stage for the lie that would unravel Imani's world. She sat alone, Julian absent. "Work," he'd mumbled, while Dr. Hargrove delivered the verdict with clinical detachment. "I'm afraid the tests are conclusive, Mrs. Dayton. You are barren. There's no possibility of conception. The word barren hit like a slap, stealing her breath. Imani's mind reeled, questions tumbling over one another, but Dr. Hargrove offered no comfort, only a thin smile and a referral to a specialist she'd never see. She drove home in a daze, the word echoing in her skull. Barren. Worthless. A failure in the only role the Daytons deem worthy. That evening, the trap snapped shut. Imani stood in the grand foyer, her hands trembling as Eleanor descended the spiral staircase, her silver hair immaculate, her expression carved from ice. Julian stood beside her, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the floor. A manila folder lay on the table between them, divorce papers already drawn up. "Sign them, Imani," Eleanor said, her voice as cold as the marble beneath their feet. "Your purpose here was to provide an heir, and you are barren. You are no longer of any use to us." Imani's heart stopped. She looked to Julian, waiting for him to speak, to fight for her, for them. But he said nothing, his silence a betrayal sharper than any words. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Julian," she whispered, her voice breaking, "is this what you want?" He flinched, his hands clenching, but he didn't meet her gaze. It's for the best," he muttered, the words hollow. "The family, the legacy." Eleanor's lips curved into a smile, thin and triumphant. "Leave this house immediately," she said. "You'll take nothing but what you brought. The Daytons have no place for you." Imani's world shattered, the pieces falling around her like glass. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to tear apart the lies she could feel but couldn't yet name. But the weight of their rejection crushed her voice. She signed the papers, her hands shaking, each stroke of the pen severing the life she'd built. A single suitcase waited by the door. Her clothes, a few books, the remnants of a dream. The butler, his face impassive, handed it to her as she stepped into the night. The heavy oak doors closed behind her with a thud that echoed like a gunshot. Imani stood on the gravel drive, the mansion's lights glowing mockingly behind her. The lie they'd told, barren, was a blade in her heart, but something deeper stirred within her, a spark of defiance. They thought they'd broken her, cast her out as a footnote in their storied legacy. They were wrong. As she walked away, the cold night air biting her skin, Imani made a silent vow. This was not the end. They had taken everything, her love, her home, her dignity. But they would not take her spirit. The Daytons had no idea what they'd unleashed, and one day she would return, not as the wife they discarded, but as the woman who would claim it all. The bus rattled along the cracked streets of Eastside, the neighborhood Imani Washington had once called home. The Dayton mansion, with its suffocating opulence, was a world away now, replaced by the familiar hum of life. Children laughing in the street, the sizzle of food trucks, the rhythm of jazz spilling from an open window. Imani sat by the smudged bus window, her single suitcase wedged between her knees, her heart a tangle of grief and rage. The word barren still burned in her mind, a cruel brand seared into her soul by Eleanor Dayton's icy voice. But beneath the pain, a quiet strength stirred, whispering that this was not her end. She stepped off the bus in front of her grandmother's modest row house, its faded yellow paint and sagging porch, a stark contrast to the marble halls she'd left behind. The door swung open before she could knock, and there was Nana, her eyes sharp and knowing, her arms wide enough to hold the world. "Come here, child," Nana said, her voice a balm. Imani collapsed into the embrace, the tears she'd held back for days finally spilling over. Nana didn't ask questions, not yet. She just held her, the scent of lavender and home-cooked greens wrapping Imani in a love that asked for nothing in return. The days that followed were a haze of grief. Imani curled up in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by relics of a girl who'd dreamed big. Debate team trophies, a dog-eared copy of Their Eyes Were Watching God, a photo of her parents, gone too soon. The weight of the Daytons' betrayal pressed down on her, each memory of Julian's silence a fresh wound. She replayed Eleanor's words, the doctor's cold diagnosis, the divorce papers that stripped her bare. Barren. Useless. The lie clung to her like damp rot, threatening to drown her spirit. But then a shift. A week after her return, Imani woke to a wave of nausea, her body rebelling against the oatmeal Nana insisted she eat. She brushed it off as stress, but the feeling persisted, a nagging pull that sent her to a free clinic 2 blocks away. The nurse, a woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense braid, ran the tests. When she returned, her face was alight with a smile that made Imani's heart stutter. "Congratulations, Ms. Washington," she said, handing over a slip of paper. "You're 8 weeks pregnant." The world tilted. Imani stared at the ultrasound image, a grainy blur that held a truth the Daytons had tried to bury. Pregnant, not barren. The diagnosis was a lie, a meticulously crafted weapon to erase her from their legacy. Rage surged through her, hot and clarifying, burning away the fog of despair. Eleanor had orchestrated it all: the doctor, the tests, Julian's complicity. They'd cast her out, thinking they'd won, but they'd missed the seed already growing within her, a secret that would one day uproot their empire. Imani's first instinct was to storm back to the mansion, to shove the truth in Eleanor's smug face, but she stopped herself. The Daytons were ruthless. They'd deny the child, discredit her, or worse, try to take him. No, she would protect this baby, her baby, with everything she had. She made a vow, whispering it to the tiny life inside her. "I'll keep you safe, and one day we'll take back what's ours." The next 5 years were a quiet rebirth. Imani threw herself into rebuilding, her mind as sharp as ever. She started small, taking freelance consulting jobs, using her financial acumen to help local businesses navigate budgets and loans. Her reputation grew, her name whispered with respect in community centers and small offices. By year 2, she'd saved enough to start her own firm, Washington Solutions, a beacon for women and minority-owned businesses seeking a fair shot. She worked late into the nights, her desk littered with spreadsheets and coffee mugs, driven by a fire that refused to dim. Her greatest joy, though, was Leo. Born with a shock of curls and eyes that mirrored Julian's, he was her lion, her strength. Every milestone, his first laugh, his wobbly steps, his endless questions, stitched her heart back together. She raised him in Nana's house, surrounded by love and stories of their heritage, teaching him to be proud of his roots. Leo was her secret weapon, proof of the Daytons' lie. But more than that, he was her reason to keep going. The community embraced them. Neighbors brought casseroles, kids played tag with Leo in the yard, and Nana's church choir sang his praises, literally. Imani found solace in the rhythm of this life, so different from the sterile perfection of the Dayton mansion. Yet she never forgot. Each night, as she tucked Leo into bed, she'd look at his face, so like Julian's, yet so purely her own, and feel the ember of justice still burning. She was biding her time, gathering strength. One evening, as Leo colored at the kitchen table, Imani scrolled through her phone, her eyes catching on a headline: "Dayton Patriarch Passes, Will to be Revealed." Her breath hitched. It was Julian's grandfather, the only Dayton who'd ever shown her a shred of kindness. She remembered his words, spoken over brandy one rare evening: "The legacy belongs to the true heir." The memory sparked something fierce in her. She looked at Leo, his small hand clutching a crayon, and knew the time was coming. The Daytons had built their empire on lies. She would tear it down with the truth. Imani stood, her resolve hardening like steel. She wasn't the broken woman they'd thrown out. She was a mother, a warrior, a force they'd never seen coming. The secret she carried wasn't just her son. It was the power to rewrite their story. And she would, when the moment was right. The small television in Nana's living room flickered, casting a soft glow across the worn couch where Imani Washington sat, her fingers absently tracing the rim of a chipped mug. The news ticker scrolled across the screen, its words slicing through the quiet hum of the East Side evening. Edward Dayton, patriarch of Dayton dynasty, passes at 82. Imani's breath caught, her heart stuttering as the anchor's voice droned on about the family's storied legacy. Edward, Julian's grandfather, had been the only Dayton to offer her a sliver of kindness, a nod at a gala, a fleeting smile over brandy, a murmured comment about true heirs that now echoed like a prophecy. The mug slipped from her hands, landing softly on the rug. 5 years had passed since the Daytons cast her out, branding her barren, stripping her of her dignity with a lie. 5 years of rebuilding, of pouring her soul into her son, Leo, and her fledgling firm, Washington Solutions. She'd carved out a life here, surrounded by the warmth of her community, but the scars of betrayal still pulsed beneath her skin. The news of Edward's death wasn't just a headline, it was a spark, igniting something fierce and unyielding within her. Imani stood, pacing the cramped room, her mind racing. She remembered a late-night conversation with Edward, his voice gravelly but kind, his words laced with an old man's regret. "The legacy must go to someone worthy," he'd said, his eyes lingering on her as if he saw past the Dayton name she carried then. "To the true heir." At the time, she'd thought it a polite sentiment, a rare moment of warmth in a family of ice. Now it felt like a call from the grave, a challenge to reclaim what was hers, not for herself, but for Leo. She glanced at her son, sprawled on the floor with a coloring book, his 5-year-old face a mirror of Julian's, softened by her own fierce spirit. Leo was the Dayton's blood, their rightful heir, and the living proof of their lie. The thought of him, her lion, her heart, ignited a fire in her chest. This wasn't about revenge, not anymore. It was about justice, about securing the future her son deserved. The Daytons had taken everything from her, but they would not take Leo's birthright. The next morning, Imani sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open, the news article about Edward's will still glowing on the screen. The anchor had mentioned a public reading, a formality for a family obsessed with appearances. Imani's pulse quickened. If Edward's will favored Julian's firstborn, as she suspected, Leo was the key to unraveling the Daytons' carefully curated world. But she needed more than instinct. She needed a plan, one as sharp and unyielding as Eleanor's cruelty. She reached out to Aisha Carter, a lawyer whose name was whispered with reverence in legal circles. Aisha was a force, tall with a commanding presence and a reputation for dismantling powerful families in court. They met at a bustling coffee shop, the kind where East Side locals swapped stories over steaming mugs. Aisha listened as Imani recounted her story. The marriage, the betrayal, the lie about her infertility, the son she'd raised in secret. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled, betraying the storm within. "You're saying they falsified a medical diagnosis to push you out?" Aisha's eyes narrowed, her pen tapping the table like a metronome. "That's fraud, coercion, and a hell of a motive. If we can prove it, we're not just talking inheritance. We're talking criminal charges." Imani nodded, her resolve hardening. "I don't just want Leo's rights. I want them to pay for what they did." Aisha leaned forward, her voice low and electric. "Then we need evidence, the doctor, the records, any paper trail, and we need to move fast. Before that will is read and they lock in their narrative." The plan took shape over the next hour, each step a brick in the foundation of Imani's counterattack. Aisha would hire a private investigator to dig into the doctor's history, to uncover any payments or pressure from Eleanor. They'd need Leo's paternity confirmed, though Imani already knew the truth. His face was evidence enough, and they'd prepare for the reading of the will, a moment that could shift the balance of power. Imani felt a thrill, not of fear, but of purpose. She was no longer the woman who'd walked away with a suitcase and a broken heart. She was a mother, a warrior, and she was ready to fight. That night, as she tucked Leo into bed, his small hand curled around hers, Imani felt the weight of her decision. "Mama, why do you look so strong today?" he asked, his voice sleepy but curious. She smiled, brushing a curl from his forehead. "Because I'm fighting for us, baby. For you." As Leo drifted off, Imani stood by his window, staring into the night. The Daytons thought they'd buried her, but they'd only planted a seed. Now it was sprouting, and she would return, not as their victim, but as their reckoning. The will's reading was coming, and with it, her chance to claim what was rightfully Leo's. The game had changed, and Imani Washington was ready to play. The air in Aisha Carter's office was thick with the scent of coffee and determination. Imani Washington sat across from her, her fingers tracing the edge of a manila folder, her eyes sharp with purpose. It was a late Thursday evening, The East Side neighborhood outside buzzing with life. But inside, the world narrowed to a single mission, dismantling the lie that had shattered Imani's life. 5 years ago, the Daytons had branded her barren, casting her out with a forged diagnosis and a divorce. Now, with Edward Dayton's will reading looming, Imani was ready to strike back, not with fury, but with precision. Aisha leaned forward, her braids catching the lamplight as she spread a stack of documents across the desk. "We've got one shot at this, Imani," she said, her voice a low, steady drumbeat. "If we're going to prove Eleanor orchestrated that diagnosis, we need hard evidence. Bank records, witnesses, something that ties her to the lie." Imani nodded, her jaw tight. She'd hired Aisha for her reputation as a legal shark, but it was her fire, her hunger for justice, that made Imani trust her completely. Their weapon was Marcus Reed, a private investigator with a knack for uncovering secrets the powerful thought buried. Marcus was a wiry man in his 50s, his graying beard and quiet demeanor masking a relentless drive. He sat in the corner, scribbling notes as Aisha briefed him. "Dr. Hargrove's the key," Marcus said, his voice gravelly. "If he faked Imani's results, there's a trail, money, emails, maybe a scared nurse who saw too much. I'll start with his financials and work backward." Imani's heart raced, but she kept her composure. She learned to hide her fire, to channel it into strategy. "What about Eleanor?" she asked. "She's too smart to leave her name on anything." Marcus's lips twitched into a half-smile. "Nobody's that smart. Power makes people sloppy. I'll find the cracks." The investigation moved like a shadow, silent but relentless. Marcus began with Dr. Hargrove's clinic, a sleek operation that catered to the elite. Posing as a maintenance worker, he gained access to old records, combing through files for any trace of Imani's visit. Late-night calls to Aisha revealed the first break, a series of payments from a shell company, Brightwood Holdings, to Hargrove's personal account, starting a month before Imani's diagnosis and ending a month after. The amounts were staggering, 6 figures, funneled through offshore accounts. Brightwood was a ghost, but its registration traced back to a law firm tied to Eleanor Dayton. Imani's blood boiled as Aisha laid out the evidence. "This is it," she whispered, staring at the bank records. "She bought him." But it wasn't enough. Not yet. They needed a witness, someone to confirm the lie wasn't just financial, but personal. Marcus turned to the clinic staff, tracking down a retired nurse named Clara Evans. Clara lived in a modest suburb, her garden overgrown, her eyes haunted when Marcus knocked on her door. "I knew this day would come," she said, her voice trembling. Over tea, she confessed. She'd overheard Eleanor threaten Hargrove in a closed-door meeting, promising to ruin him if he didn't deliver the results she wanted. Clara had stayed silent, fearing for her job, but guilt had gnawed at her since. "I saw you, Mrs. Dayton," Clara told Imani when they met, her hands twisting a handkerchief. "You were so kind even when they treated you like dirt. I should have spoken up." Imani reached across the table, squeezing Clara's hand. "You're speaking now," she said softly. "That's what matters." Clara's testimony, paired with the bank records, was a dagger aimed at Eleanor's heart. But Imani wanted more. She wanted the Dayton's empire exposed. Marcus dug deeper, uncovering financial mismanagement in the Dayton portfolio. Julian, now running the family business after his father's death, was a shadow of his grandfather's competence. Properties were over-leveraged, deals were botched, and Eleanor had siphoned millions into private accounts, hiding her tracks behind dummy corporations. Each revelation fueled Imani's resolve. The Daytons weren't just cruel, they were fragile, their legacy a house of cards waiting for a push. The final piece was Leo. Imani had always known he was Julian's son, his face a living echo of the man who'd betrayed her. But the law demanded proof. She'd kept a memento from her marriage, a silver hairbrush Julian had left behind, strands of his hair still caught in its bristles. Aisha arranged for a discreet DNA test. The results delivered in a sealed envelope that Imani opened alone in her bedroom. The numbers were undeniable, 99.9% match. Leo was a Dayton, the true heir Edward's will would name. She clutched the paper to her chest, tears falling, not of sorrow but of triumph. This was her weapon, her truth. As the will reading approached, Imani and Aisha finalized their strategy. They'd walk into that room armed with evidence, bank records, Clara's sworn statement, the DNA test. Eleanor's lie would unravel before the family, the lawyers, the world. Imani stood in her small apartment, staring at her reflection in a cracked mirror. The woman looking back wasn't the broken wife who'd left the mansion with a suitcase. She was a mother, a fighter, a force forged in pain and patience. Leo's laughter echoed from the next room, grounding her. This was for him. The night before the reading, Imani sat with Aisha, reviewing every detail. They'll fight dirty, Aisha warned. Eleanor's a snake, and Julian's weak, but he's still her pawn. Imani nodded, her eyes steely. Let them try. I've got the truth, and it's sharper than anything they've got. The stage was set, the pieces in place. The Daytons had no idea what was coming, but Imani did, and she was ready. The Dayton family's law office was a cathedral of wealth, its polished mahogany walls and soaring windows, screaming power. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and older money, and the long conference table gleamed under a chandelier that could have funded a small nation. Imani Washington stood outside the heavy double doors, her heart a steady drumbeat, her hand clasping the small, warm grip of her son, Leo. At 5 years old, he looked up at her with eyes that held her fire, and Julian's shadow, his navy blazer and tiny tie, a silent declaration of his place in this world. She adjusted her own tailored black suit, its sharp lines a far cry from the cream dresses she'd worn as a Dayton wife. Today, she wasn't a wife. She was a queen, and this was her battlefield. Inside, the room buzzed with restrained anticipation. The Dayton clan sat in a semicircle of privilege. Julian, his jaw tight, his new wife, Cassandra, at his side, her blonde hair and vacant smile handpicked by Eleanor. Cassandra's hand rested on her stomach, a calculated gesture that screamed intent. Eleanor herself presided at the head of the table, her silver hair immaculate, her pale blue eyes scanning the room with the smug certainty of someone who'd already won. A handful of cousins and uncles filled the seats, their faces a mix of boredom and greed, waiting for the spoils of Edward Dayton's will. The family's lawyer, Mr. Grayson, stood at a podium, his voice droning as he prepared to read the document that would shape their future. Imani's pulse quickened, but her face remained a mask of calm. In her briefcase, carried by Aisha Carter at her side, lay the arsenal they'd built. Bank records tying Eleanor to Dr. Hargrove's bribe, Clara Evans's sworn testimony, and the DNA test proving Leo's paternity. Aisha, fierce in a crimson blazer, gave Imani a nod, her eyes glinting with the thrill of the fight. They'd planned this moment meticulously, every step choreographed to dismantle the Dayton's lies. The doors were still closed, the reading moments away. Imani squeezed Leo's hand, whispering, "Stay close, baby. We're about to change everything." Grayson cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "We now proceed to the reading of Edward Dayton's last will and testament." He adjusted his glasses, his tone formal. "To my grandson, Julian Dayton, I leave the stewardship of the Dayton legacy, provided he upholds its values. However, the entirety of my estate, properties, shares, and the Dayton Trust shall pass to the firstborn, legitimate son of Julian Dayton, to be held in trust until his majority." A ripple of tension swept the room. Eleanor's lips curved into a triumphant smile, her gaze darting to Cassandra, who sat straighter, her hand still on her stomach. Julian shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flickering with something like relief. The room assumed the obvious. Cassandra would bear the heir, securing the Dayton fortune. The cousins muttered, their own hopes dimming. Eleanor's victory seemed assured, her control over the family unbreakable. Then the doors swung open. The room froze as Imani stepped inside, Leo at her side, Aisha a step behind. Every eye turned, the air thick with shock. Imani's heels clicked against the marble floor, each step deliberate, her posture regal. Leo's small hand in hers was an anchor, his presence a silent thunderclap. Julian's face drained of color, his mouth opening soundlessly. Cassandra's hand dropped, her composure cracking. Eleanor's smile vanished, her eyes narrowing to slits, a predator scenting danger. Who let her in? Eleanor's voice was a venomous hiss, cutting through the silence. This is a private affair. Imani didn't flinch. She met Eleanor's gaze, her own eyes blazing with a fire forged in 5 years of pain and purpose. I'm here for my son, she said, her voice clear and unyielding, resonating in the cavernous room. The true heir to the Dayton legacy. Gasps rippled through the room. Julian staggered to his feet, his voice a broken whisper. Imani, what? He stared at Leo, his features mirrored in the boy's face, and his knees buckled. Cassandra clutched his arm, her face a mask of confusion and fear. Eleanor stood, her chair scraping harshly. How dare you, she spat, her composure unraveling. You have no place here. Security. Sit down, Eleanor, Aisha snapped, her voice a whip. She stepped forward, placing the briefcase on the table with a deliberate thud. We're not going anywhere until you hear the truth. Grayson, flustered, raised a hand. Mrs. Washington, this is highly irregular. Then let's make it regular, Imani interrupted, her tone calm but ironclad. She nodded to Aisha, who opened the briefcase and slid a folder toward Grayson. That's a DNA test proving Leo is Julian's son. He's the firstborn, legitimate heir, as per Edward's will. The room erupted in whispers. Eleanor's face twisted, her hands gripping the table as if to anchor herself. This is absurd. That boy is... My son, Imani cut in, her voice rising just enough to silence the room. She lifted her chin, her gaze sweeping over the Daytons. And your lie is over. You called me Barren, threw me out with nothing. But I wasn't barren. I was pregnant, and you knew it. Julian's eyes locked on Leo, a storm of guilt and recognition swirling in them. Imani, I didn't, he began, but she raised a hand, silencing him. You stood by while your mother lied, she said, her voice steady but laced with pain. You let her destroy me, but you can't destroy the truth. Aisha stepped forward, her presence commanding. Mr. Grayson, the evidence in that folder includes bank records showing Eleanor Dayton paid Dr. Hargrove to falsify Imani's medical results. We have a witness, Clara Evans, who will testify to Eleanor's threats. This wasn't just a divorce, it was fraud, coercion, and a deliberate attempt to erase the rightful heir. The room was a powder keg, the air electric with shock. Grayson fumbled with the folder, his hands trembling as he scanned the documents. Eleanor's face was a mask of fury, but beneath it, Imani saw something new. Fear. The queen of the Daytons was cornered, her empire teetering. Imani knelt beside Leo, her voice soft but caring. This is your birthright, baby, she whispered, her eyes never leaving Eleanor's. And no one will take it from you. The room held its breath, the weight of Imani's return settling like a storm. She wasn't just back, she was unstoppable, a queen claiming her throne, and the Daytons would never be the same. The conference room in the Dayton family's law office was a battlefield, the air crackling with tension as Imani Washington stood tall, her son Leo's hand clasped firmly in hers. The chandelier above cast jagged light across the polished table, illuminating the stunned faces of the Dayton clan. Eleanor Dayton's icy composure had shattered, her pale eyes blazing with fury as she gripped the table's edge. Julian, her son, sat frozen, his gaze locked on Leo, whose face, so like his own, was a living accusation. Cassandra, Julian's new wife, clutched her chair, her perfect poise crumbling. The family's lawyer, Mr. Grayson, clutched the folder of evidence Imani and Aisha Carter had presented, his hands trembling as he processed the weight of the moment. Imani's voice still echoed in the room. This is your birthright, baby, and no one will take it from you. Eleanor was the first to break the silence, her voice a venomous snarl. This is outrageous, she spat, rising to her feet, her silver hair glinting like a crown she no longer deserved. Who is this child? Some bastard you're trying to pawn off as a Dayton. Her words were a desperate swing, but they landed hollow, the room's eyes shifting to Leo, whose presence was undeniable proof. Imani's gaze didn't waver. She stepped forward, her voice calm but razor-sharp, cutting through Eleanor's bluster. His name is Leo Washington, she said, each word deliberate. And he is Julian's son, your grandson. the firstborn heir to the Dayton legacy, as Edward's will demands. She paused, letting the truth settle like a guillotine. You called me Barren, Eleanor. You paid Dr. Hargrove to lie, to drive me out. But your lie couldn't erase the truth growing inside me. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Julian's cousins exchanged shocked glances, their whispers a rising tide. Julian himself looked like a man unmoored, his face pale, his eyes darting between Leo and his mother. Imani, he stammered, his voice breaking. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't. Silence! Eleanor snapped, her authority fraying. She turned to Grayson, her tone imperious. This is a fabrication. Throw her out, now! But Grayson didn't move. His eyes were glued to the documents Aisha had slid across the table. Bank records, Clara Evans's sworn testimony, the DNA test confirming Leo's paternity with a 9.9% match. Aisha stepped forward, her crimson blazer a bold contrast to the room's muted tones, her voice a controlled storm. Mr. Grayson, let's be clear. Those records show payments from Eleanor's shell company, Brightwood Holdings, to Dr. Hargrove, timed perfectly with Imani's so-called diagnosis. Clara Evans, a nurse at the clinic, witnessed Eleanor's threats to ensure the lie. And this, she tapped the DNA report, proves Leo is Julian's son, the rightful heir. Grayson's face blanched as he flipped through the pages, each one a nail in Eleanor's coffin. The cousins leaned forward, their murmurs growing louder, their loyalty to Eleanor wavering. Cassandra's hand fell from her stomach, her dreams of producing the Dayton heir dissolving. Julian's head dropped into his hands, his shoulders shaking as the weight of his mother's betrayal sank in. Eleanor's voice rose, shrill and desperate. This is preposterous, a conspiracy cooked up by a bitter woman. She pointed at Imani, her finger trembling. You were nothing when we took you in, and you're nothing now. Imani's laugh was low, cutting, a sound that silenced the room. Nothing, she said, stepping closer, her eyes locking onto Eleanor's. You thought you could break me, Eleanor. You thought your money, your power could erase me. But look at my son. She gestured to Leo, who stood quietly, his wide eyes taking in the chaos. He's everything you tried to destroy, and he's the future you can't control. Aisha opened the briefcase again, pulling out Clara's affidavit. This is a sworn statement from Clara Evans, she said, her voice steady but electric. She heard you threaten Hargrove, Eleanor. She saw you manipulate the truth to protect your precious legacy. And these bank records, she held up a sheaf of papers, show you paid over $200,000 to make it happen. You didn't just betray Imani, you betrayed your own family. The room was a powder keg, the air heavy with the scent of Eleanor's downfall. Grayson cleared his throat, his voice shaky but resolute. Mrs. Dayton, if these documents are verified, and they appear airtight, Leo Washington is indeed the firstborn son of Julian Dayton. Per Edward's will, he is the sole heir to the estate. Eleanor's face contorted, a mask of rage and fear. No, she shouted, slamming her fist on the table. I won't let this happen. That boy is no Dayton. But her words were drowned by the rising tide of dissent. The cousins, once cowed by her authority, began to whisper rebellion. One, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret, spoke up. If this is true, Eleanor, you've lied to us all. You've jeopardized the family name. Julian lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed, his voice barely audible. Mother, did you do this? Did you know? His question hung in the air, a son's plea for truth. Eleanor's silence was damning, her lips pressed into a thin line as the room turned against her. Imani knelt beside Leo, her voice soft but caring. You're my strength, she whispered, brushing a curl from his forehead. She stood, facing the room, her presence commanding. This isn't about revenge, she said. It's about justice. For my son. For the truth you tried to bury. Grayson nodded, closing the folder. I'll need to verify the DNA test independently, but the evidence is compelling. Leo Washington appears to be the rightful heir. The words were a thunderclap, sealing Eleanor's defeat. She sank into her chair, her empire crumbling, her arrogance reduced to ash. Imani took Leo's hand, her heart soaring. The truth was out, a light piercing the Dayton's carefully crafted darkness. She'd walked into this room a ghost from their past, but she would leave as their future, a queen who'd reclaimed her son's birthright, and with it, her own power. The Dayton mansion, once a fortress of cold grandeur, stood silent under a gray autumn sky, its white columns dulled by the weight of scandal. Inside, the echoes of Imani Washington's triumph still lingered, the truth she'd unveiled in the law office a month ago, reverberating through the Dayton family like a shockwave. Eleanor Dayton, the Iron Matriarch, was gone. Her empire crumbled, her name now synonymous with fraud. Criminal charges loomed, fraud and coercion pinned to her like a scarlet letter. Her assets frozen as investigators unraveled her web of shell companies. The Dayton legacy, once a beacon of untouchable wealth, was in tatters, and Imani stood at the heart of its ruin, not as a destroyer, but as a rebuilder. She sat now in a modest office downtown, the new nerve center of the Dayton estate, which she controlled as Leo's legal guardian. The room was a far cry from the opulent boardrooms of the past. No chandeliers, no mahogany, just a sturdy desk piled with papers and a window overlooking the vibrant chaos of Eastside. Leo, her 6-year-old son, played in the corner, his laughter a melody that anchored her. The DNA test had been verified, the will upheld. Leo was the rightful heir, the firstborn son of Julian Dayton, entitled to the family's vast fortune. But Imani hadn't fought for gold or glory. She'd fought for justice, for her son's future, and for the chance to redefine a name that had once crushed her. The fallout had been swift and brutal. Eleanor's arrest made headlines, her icy composure shattered in grainy photos as she was led from her penthouse in handcuffs. The cousins, once loyal to her reign, turned on her, their greed outweighing their allegiance. Margaret, the sharp-eyed cousin who'd spoken out at the will reading, was now cooperating with prosecutors, eager to salvage her own share of the estate. The Dayton name, once a symbol of untouchable power, was now a cautionary tale, whispered in boardrooms and gossip columns alike. Julian had tried to reach her, his calls and letters a flood of apologies, each one more desperate than the last. "I didn't know, Imani," he wrote, his handwriting shaky. "I was weak. Let me make this right." But Imani's heart had no room for his regret. He'd stood silent as his mother cast her out, his love a fragile thing that buckled under Eleanor's will. She didn't answer his calls, didn't read his letters beyond the first. Leo didn't need a father who'd failed them both. He needed her, and she was enough. Imani's focus was on the future. The Dayton fortune, properties, investments, a trust worth billions, was now under her stewardship, a responsibility she wielded with precision. She could have moved into the mansion, draped herself in the trappings of wealth, but that wasn't her way. Instead, she stayed in Eastside, in the row house where Nana's love had rebuilt her. The mansion was being sold, its proceeds earmarked for something greater. Imani had a vision, one that would transform the Dayton name into a force for good. She founded the Leo Dayton Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to empowering single mothers and children in underserved communities, particularly communities of color. The foundation's first act was to fund a community center in Eastside, a sprawling space with classrooms, a daycare, and a job training program. Imani poured her financial expertise into its structure, ensuring every dollar was stretched to its fullest potential. She hired local women to run it, women like her who'd fought their way through hardship, their resilience a mirror of her own. The center's playground, already alive with children's laughter, was named after Nana, a tribute to the woman who'd held Imani together when the world tried to tear her apart. The work was grueling, the hours long, but it filled Imani with a purpose she'd never known in the gilded cage of the Dayton mansion. She met with community leaders, secured grants, and spoke at events, her voice steady and commanding, her story a beacon for those who'd been told they were less. The Dayton name, once a symbol of exclusion, now stood for hope, its wealth redirected to lift up those it had once ignored. Imani didn't erase the past. She rewrote it, brick by brick, into a legacy her son could be proud of. One crisp afternoon, Imani stood in the playground, watching Leo chase a soccer ball with a pack of kids, his curls bouncing, his smile brighter than the sun. The center buzzed around them, mothers learning new skills in classrooms, children painting murals on the walls. Isha Carter joined her crimson blazer swapped for a casual sweater, her eyes warm with pride. "You did this, Imani," she said, gesturing to the chaos of life around them. "You turned their poison into medicine." Imani smiled, her heart full. "It's for him," she said, nodding toward Leo, "and for every kid like him. They deserve a world that sees their worth." As the sun dipped low, casting golden light across the playground, Imani felt a peace she'd never known in the Dayton mansion. She was no longer the wife they'd discarded, the woman they'd branded barren. She was a mother, a leader, a force who'd taken their lies and forged a new truth. The Dayton legacy was hers now, not to hoard, but to share. And as Leo ran to her, his small hand slipping into hers, she knew she'd won, not just for herself, but for a future where no one would be cast aside. And so, Imani Washington's journey comes to a close. Not with vengeance, but with a legacy reborn, a testament to resilience, truth, and the unbreakable bond of a mother's love. From the ashes of betrayal, she built a future that shines brighter than the Dayton mansion ever could, proving that true power lies not in wealth, but in purpose. What did you take from Imani's story? Did her strength inspire you? Or perhaps her fight for justice sparked a thought about your own battles? I'd love to hear your reflections. Drop them in the comments below and let me know where you're reading from and what time it is there. Your thoughts mean the world to this story's life. Thank you for joining me on this journey, for standing with Imani through every twist and triumph. Until we meet again in the next tale, keep carrying your own fire and never let anyone dim it.